What would you do if your child was humiliated in front of a cabin full of strangers, just for sitting in the seat they'd rightfully been assigned? For Jalen Brooks, a quiet 17-year-old traveling with his mother, first class should have been nothing more than a comfortable ride home. But when a flight attendant questioned his place there not because of his ticket, but because of an unspoken assumption that cabin became a stage for something much bigger, Victoria Brooks, his mother, wasn't just any passenger. She was a woman who'd built an empire, who knew the weight of silence and the power of speaking at exactly the right moment. As the engines hummed and the whispers grew louder, one choice would set off a chain of events that would ground an entire plane, shake a billion-dollar airline, and challenge the way an industry treats the people it serves. Was this simply a misunderstanding, or was it a moment that revealed a deeper truth about who is seen and who is questioned? Stay with us, and if you believe in dignity over prejudice, like, share, and subscribe before we begin this journey. The overhead chime sounded, and the boarding door swung open with a quiet hiss. Passengers began filing into Pacific Skies Airlines Flight 742, their shoes clicking against the jet bridge's worn floor. The air inside the cabin carried the familiar mix of cool, recycled air and faint coffee brewing somewhere in the galley. Jalen Brooks stepped into the first-class cabin like he belonged there, because he did. 17 years old, tall for his age, dressed in a navy hoodie that looked freshly pressed, dark jeans, and clean white sneakers. His carry-on was a small leather roller, the kind you only saw in designer catalogs. He walked with an unhurried pace, scanning the row numbers above, until he found it, 3A, window seat. He slid his bag into the overhead bin, careful not to bump the neatly arranged luggage already there. Then he sat, pulling a hardcover copy of Between the World and Me from his backpack. He opened it to a dog-eared page, letting the hum of the air system settle around him. From across the aisle, a middle-aged man in 3B gave him a polite nod. Jalen nodded back, eyes returning to the book. Boarding was still in its early stages, a few scattered conversations, the muted thump of carry-ons rolling down the aisle. Then a voice broke the quiet. "Excuse me," a woman's voice said, sharp but coated in a practiced politeness. Jalen looked up. Standing over him was a flight attendant, tall, in a pressed Pacific Skies uniform. Her name tag read Helen. Her smile was tight, her eyes scanning him before glancing down at the seat. She had that look, the kind that wasn't about the seat, but about him. "This seat is reserved for our premium guests," she said. Jalen blinked, closed his book gently, and looked her in the eye. "I know," he said. "I'm in the right seat." Her smile didn't soften. "I'm not sure that's correct," she replied, voice just loud enough for the man in 3B to hear. "Sometimes people think they've been upgraded when it's actually a mistake." Jalen reached into his backpack, pulling out his boarding pass. 3A, first class, he said, holding it up. Helen didn't take it. She glanced at it for half a second, then waved her hand as if dismissing a fly. "I'll need to double-check this with the manifest," she said. "It happens more often than you'd think." Two passengers in the second row looked over. One, a younger white woman in 2D, tilted her phone slightly toward the aisle. The camera lens glinted faintly under the overhead lights. Helen gave Jalen one more practiced smile before moving toward the galley. As she walked away, Jalen heard a low whisper from behind him. "Probably a mistake," someone murmured. "He's just a kid." Jalen didn't turn around. He'd heard those words before. in stores, at school events, even once in a hotel lobby. He opened his book again, eyes scanning the words, but the sentences seemed farther away now, blurred by the awareness of eyes on him. The boarding process continued, more passengers stepping into first class, placing their coats and bags, exchanging quiet pleasantries. Then Helen returned, this time with a younger male attendant trailing her. His name tag read Evan. His posture was less rigid, but his eyes darted quickly between Jalen and Helen. "Sir," Helen began, her tone still in that space between customer service and command. "We've reviewed the manifest, and we're not seeing your name assigned to 3A. Jalen closed his book again, resting his hands on it. "It's there," he said evenly. "Can you check again?" "What's your name?" "Sweetheart," Helen asked. "Jalen," he said. "Jalen Brooks." Helen glanced at Evan, who tapped on his small tablet. "Huh," Evan said under his breath. "That's odd." Helen tilted her head, then spoke as if she were offering him a gift. "Listen, it's not a big deal. We have an open seat back in 28C. You'll still get to Seattle. Just not here. Let's not make this complicated." Jalen looked past her, out the window, where the jet bridge's metal frame connected to the plane. His reflection in the glass looked calm, but his chest felt tight. "I'm not moving," he said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. But the firmness in his voice made the man in 3B glance up, eyebrows raised. "You need to comply," Helen said, her voice sharpening, "or we'll have to get security involved." Across the aisle, the woman in 2D lowered her phone to her lap, thumb moving quickly. The little red light of a live stream camera blinked faintly. From the front of the cabin, the sound of heavier footsteps approached. A tall man with broad shoulders and silver streaks in his hair stepped into view, wearing the crisp uniform of a captain. His name tag read Langford. "Captain Drew Langford." "What's the issue?" he asked, scanning the aisle. "Passenger in 3A isn't showing in the manifest," Helen said quickly, refusing to move. Langford's eyes landed on Jalen. "Young man," he said, "we're already boarding late. Let's not delay this flight over a simple seating mistake." Jalen held out his boarding pass. "First class seat, 3A. Confirmed." Langford glanced at it for less than a second before shaking his head. "Printing errors happen. You need to take your assigned seat in economy." Jalen felt the heat rising in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "I'm not moving." Langford's jaw tightened. "Security," he called toward the galley, gate 12. The woman in 2D shifted in her seat, angling her phone slightly toward the aisle again. In her live stream, comments began to flow faster. Jalen leaned back slightly, eyes on the captain. Somewhere inside, a familiar question was forming. Would this have happened if he looked different? He already knew the answer. And in that moment, one thought cut through everything else. He needed to stay calm, because somewhere in the terminal, his mother was only a phone call away. And when she arrived, the real turbulence would begin. The hum of boarding continued, but the air in first class felt heavier now, as if an invisible thread of tension had been pulled too tight. Jalen could feel it, the subtle shift in the way people looked at him, the way their eyes slid away quickly, pretending not to stare. Helen stood a few feet away near the galley, speaking in a low voice to Evan, her arms folded across her chest. She glanced toward him twice, each time with that same look of polite suspicion, as if politeness could soften the edge of disbelief. Evan tapped on his tablet, frowning. "It is weird," he murmured to her. "His boarding pass scans correctly. It just isn't in the manifest. That's because it's probably wrong." Helen replied, "You know how these upgrades go. Someone makes a mistake at the gate, and then we're the ones cleaning it up." From his seat. Jalen heard enough to know exactly what they thought of him. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not in their eyes. He leaned back slightly, letting his gaze drift out the window. The jet bridge was still connected, and beyond it, the terminal bustled with passengers waiting to board other flights. Somewhere out there was his mother. If he called her now, she would drop everything. But a part of him hesitated. He could almost hear her voice from a conversation they had months ago. Don't let them decide who you are before you decide what to do. The scrape of shoes on the carpet pulled his attention back. Helen was returning, Evan following behind like a shadow. Her smile had not changed, but her tone was clipped. "Mr. Brooks," she said, stressing the last name as if reading it from a form. "We've confirmed with the gate that you are not listed in this seat. I showed you my boarding pass," Jalen replied evenly. "And, as I explained, there may have been a processing error. We can seat you in 28C and you'll still arrive in Seattle on time." The man in 3B shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable. From 2D. Megan Lewis adjusted her phone slightly, her camera still on but hidden in her lap. Jalen met Helen's eyes. "No," he said, "this is my seat." Evan cleared his throat. "Sir, maybe if you could just Evan," Helen interrupted, her voice low but firm. "Let's not draw this out." She looked back at Jalen. "Refusing to comply will result in us calling security." From the first row, a voice spoke up. "Is there a problem here?" Jalen turned to see the man in 1B leaning slightly into the aisle. His hair was silver at the temples, his face lined with age but not weariness. His dark eyes were steady, measuring the situation. "Sir, we're resolving a seating error," Helen said quickly. The man's gaze shifted to Jalen. "Do you have your boarding pass?" Jalen held it up. "Mind if I take a look?" the man asked. Jalen hesitated, then handed it forward. The man read it carefully, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Seat 3A, he said, handing it back. "Issued at check-in this morning." Helen's smile thinned. "That may be. But nothing." The man cut in. "FAA regulations allow him to be here if he has a valid ticket and is not violating safety procedures. You cannot remove him without cause." "Sir," Helen said sharply, "are you a lawyer?" The man smiled faintly. "Better. I am a judge, and you might want to tread carefully." The words hung in the air like a dropped glass that never shattered. Helen's eyes flickered, but she held her stance. Evan's gaze dropped to the carpet. Jalen felt a flicker of something he had not allowed himself yet relief. But it was brief. He knew what was coming. Helen straightened her uniform and turned toward the cockpit. "Captain Langford will make the final call." As she disappeared down the aisle, Megan's phone vibrated softly in her hand. Her live stream was climbing over 800 viewers now. Comments scrolled across the screen. "They better not kick him out. This is so wrong. Stay calm, kid. People are watching." Jalen did not move. His book was still on his lap, closed now, but his fingers tapped against the cover in a slow, steady rhythm. His mind drifted briefly to a memory sitting at the kitchen table last summer while his mother explained shareholder rights over a plate of pancakes. At the time, it seemed abstract, distant. Now, it felt like a lifeline. Footsteps again. Captain Langford appeared, his stride brisk. What's going on here? Passenger in 3A not showing in the manifest. Refusing to move. Helen reported. Langford looked directly at Jalen. Young man, these situations happen. We can sort it out quickly if you just take the seat offered in economy. Jalen held up his boarding pass again. This is my assigned seat. Langford gave it a cursory glance, then handed it back. Printing errors happen. We cannot delay boarding over this. Please take your assigned seat and coach. I'm not moving, Jalen said. His voice was calm, but his heart pounded. Langford's jaw tightened. Security to gate 12, he said into his radio. Helen's expression softened slightly, but not out of kindness, it was satisfaction. Megan's viewers jumped past 1,000. She whispered into her phone. They're calling security on a kid with a valid ticket. From 1B. Judge Graves spoke again. Captain, you do realize that removal without cause can have serious legal consequences. Langford did not answer. His eyes stayed on Jalen. Inside. Jalen felt the familiar pressure, the push to shrink himself, to comply, to avoid making things worse. But another voice in his mind spoke louder. If you move now, you teach them they were right to question you. He sat back, hands folded on the book, eyes steady. I'm not moving, he repeated. Langford exhaled through his nose, then stepped aside as two uniformed security officers entered the cabin. The boarding chatter outside quieted, as if the tension inside had reached the ears of the passengers still in line. One officer, a tall black man with kind eyes, addressed Jalen gently. Sir, would you mind stepping off the plane so we can discuss this? Jalen looked at him, then down at the phone in his lap. His thumb moved, camera on. Recording. For documentation, he said clearly. This is Jalen Brooks, March 14th, seat 3A, valid boarding pass, being asked to leave the aircraft. Helen reached toward his phone. He shifted it out of her reach without breaking eye contact. You are not allowed to film. That's not true, Judge Graves said from 1B. FAA allows passengers to record as long as they're not interfering. The younger officer's eyes flicked toward Helen. Jalen stood slowly, picking up his backpack. His steps down the aisle were steady, each one deliberate. As he reached the boarding door, his phone buzzed in his hand. He glanced at the screen. A text. 3 words. Stay calm, Mom. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He stepped onto the jet bridge without a word. The officer followed. Behind them, Captain Langford muttered under his breath, About time. Jalen heard it. He turned his head slightly, offering the captain a smile that did not reach his eyes. Then he walked into the terminal, knowing the real story was only about to begin. The terminal outside Gate 12 felt colder than the rest of the airport. Jalen stood near the wall, his phone still in his hand, recording as passengers moved past him. The 2 security officers stayed close but did not touch him. Through the glass of the boarding door, he could still see into the first-class cabin. Helen stood at the galley, speaking animatedly to Captain Langford. Evan lingered behind her, his face tight, his eyes flicking once toward the window where Jalen stood. Jalen's phone buzzed again. Another text from his mother. On my way. He slipped the phone into his hoodie pocket and took a slow breath. The officer, with kind eyes, glanced at him. You doing all right, son? I'm fine, Jalen said. Back inside the cabin, Captain Langford stepped out into the aisle, his presence filling the space. He had the air of someone used to being obeyed, his posture rigid, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. "All right, folks," Langford said, his voice carrying over the quiet murmur of the passengers. "We're just resolving a seating matter. We'll be underway shortly." In 1B, Judge Graves leaned back in his seat, his eyes fixed on the captain. Resolving was an interesting word. He thought it was the kind of word people used when they did not want to say exactly what was happening. Megan Lewis in 2D lowered her phone into her lap, pretending to scroll. Her live stream chat had exploded with comments. "This is wild. Why are they still talking about this? Where's the kid now?" Captain Langford approached Helen. "What's the holdup?" "He refused to move." Helen replied, "Boarding pass says 3A, but the manifest shows empty. I moved him off the plane so we can take off." Langford's jaw tightened. "We'll settle it. I'll speak to him outside." As the captain stepped into the jet bridge, the officer with kind eyes stepped back, giving him room. "Young man," Langford said, his voice even but cool, "you need to understand, we cannot hold up an entire flight for one seating error. I'm sure it was a mistake at the gate. Let's rebook you into economy so we can depart." Jalen met his eyes. "It's not a mistake. I checked in this morning. I was assigned 3A. Be that as it may." Langford said, "You're not on my manifest in that seat. This is a safety and operational matter now." Jalen felt the weight of the words, the way safety was being used to make it sound official. But safety had nothing to do with it. "I have a valid ticket," he said again. Langford exhaled sharply. "You can either cooperate now, or I will file you under noncompliance, which will have consequences beyond this flight." One of the officers glanced between them, uneasy. The taller officer spoke gently. "Captain, maybe we can—" "Thank you. Gentlemen." Langford cut in. "I'll handle it from here." Back inside the cabin, passengers whispered. Judge Graves caught Evan's eye. "Does he have a valid boarding pass?" Evan hesitated. "Yes, but—" He trailed off, glancing toward Helen, but the judge pressed. Evan lowered his voice. "But Helen thinks he was upgraded by mistake and doesn't belong here." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Doesn't belong. That's an interesting choice of words." At the boarding door, Megan rose from her seat and stepped into the aisle. She leaned slightly toward Helen. "Isn't it policy to verify with the gate before removing someone?" Helen's lips pressed together. "Ma'am, please return to your seat." From the jet bridge, Langford reappeared, his expression stiff. He leaned into Helen. "Get the rest of the passengers boarded. I'll make the call in 5 minutes." Helen nodded, then turned to Evan. "Help 28C with his luggage when he gets back." Evan did not answer. He kept his eyes on the floor. Jalen stood just beyond the doorway, hearing every word. He could feel his pulse in his ears, but he kept his voice calm when he spoke. "Captain, may I speak to the gate agent?" Langford's eyes narrowed. "Why? Because they issued my ticket. If there's a mistake, they'll know. That's not necessary," Langford said flatly. "You'll take 28C." "No," Jalen said. The word was quiet, but it stopped the captain for a moment. Langford's jaw clenched. "Then I'll have to escalate this." He stepped back into the cabin, pressing a button on his radio. "Ops, this is Langford. Passenger noncompliance at gate 12. Need final clearance to deny boarding. In the terminal." The taller officer turned to Jalen. "Son, is there someone we can call for you?" Jalen's lips curved slightly. "She's already on her way. Inside." Helen started walking down the aisle, telling passengers to prepare for departure. Judge Graves watched her pass, his expression unreadable. Megan slipped back into her seat, phone in her lap, fingers typing quickly. Her stream count passed 2,000. This is going to blow up. Where's his mom? She better show up soon. In the cockpit, Langford received a crackle over his headset. "Captain, you have an incoming call from corporate operations." He frowned. Corporate rarely called directly during boarding. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. 2 minutes later, the door opened again. Langford's face was pale, his jaw tight. He walked straight to the galley where Helen stood. "There's a situation," he said quietly. Helen's brows lifted. What kind of situation? Langford glanced toward the boarding door, then back at her. "We might need to hold departure." What, why, before he could answer. The boarding door opened wider. A woman stepped in, her presence commanding the space instantly. She was tall, elegant, dressed in a cream pantsuit that contrasted sharply with her deep brown skin. Her eyes scanned the cabin once, sharp and assessing, before locking on Jalen. "Mom," he said softly. The murmurs began almost instantly. Passengers straightened in their seats. Even Helen's posture shifted, though she tried to hide it. The woman stepped closer, her heels clicking softly on the carpet. "Is this your captain?" she asked Jalen without looking away from Langford. "Yes," Jalen said. Langford cleared his throat. "Ma'am, you were just about to delay this flight," she said evenly, "because you removed my son from his assigned seat without verifying his ticket." The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Helen's mouth opened, then closed again. Evan stood frozen beside her. Langford straightened his shoulders. "And you are." She reached into her bag, pulled out a black leather card case, and flipped it open. "Victoria Brooks, CEO of Brooks Strategic Ventures. Level 4 shareholder authority with Pacific Skies Airlines." Judge Graves smiled faintly from 1B. Megan's phone buzzed in her hand as comments exploded across the screen. Langford's lips parted, but no words came out. Victoria stepped forward. "This plane isn't going anywhere until we talk." And just like that, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. It was no longer a crew versus passenger dispute. It was a standoff between authority and ownership, and everyone knew it. The first-class cabin was so quiet you could hear the click of the air vents. Every eye was on Victoria Brooks, standing tall in the aisle, her cream pantsuit almost glowing under the overhead lights. She didn't raise her voice, but there was something in the way she stood like a conductor about to start a symphony, and every player knew their part. "Captain Langford," she said, not looking away from him. "Why was my son removed from his seat without a proper ticket verification?" Langford's gaze flicked to Helen, then back to Victoria. "Ma'am, as I explained, there was a discrepancy in the manifest. For operational and safety reasons. That is not an explanation." She interrupted smoothly. "That is a deflection." "Did anyone scan his boarding pass at the gate?" Helen stepped in, her tone sharper than necessary. "We don't always scan in first class. Sometimes we confirm visually." Victoria's eyes slid to Helen, calm but cutting. "So you confirmed visually. And what exactly did you see that told you he didn't belong?" The words hung there. Even the passengers who had been trying to pretend they weren't watching could no longer look away. Megan Lewis, still holding her phone low in her lap, whispered into her live stream. She just asked the question. Comments flew across her screen. "Boom, she's not playing. Ask it again." Helen shifted her weight. "Ma'am, This isn't about who belongs. It's about following procedures." "No," Victoria said. "This is about not following them, because your procedure starts with scanning the ticket, not scanning the passenger's face." Langford's jaw clenched. Security was called because Victoria raised a hand. The gesture was small, but it silenced him mid-sentence. Security was called because your crew made a decision based on assumption, not fact, and now we're going to correct that. She turned slightly toward the boarding door. "Officer," she called. The taller of the two security officers stepped forward, his expression guarded but attentive. "Yes." "Ma'am, I want you to escort me and my son to the operations control room. We will be reviewing the manifest and the gate logs together. Captain, you will hold this flight until we return." Langford stiffened. "Ma'am, that's not how that is exactly how this will go," Victoria said. Her voice didn't rise, but something in it made the air seem to thicken. "Unless you would like this to become a federal compliance review before you even taxi to the runway." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Judge Graves smiled faintly in 1B, leaning back in his seat as if he'd been waiting for this moment. Helen looked at Evan, but he avoided her eyes. Megan adjusted her phone again, whispering, "She's taken it upstairs." Her viewer count spiked past 3,000. Langford exhaled through his nose, then gave a curt nod. "Hold boarding," he said into his radio. Victoria stepped aside so Jalen could walk past her into the jet bridge. As they exited, she rested a hand lightly on his shoulder. "You did right," she said softly. In the terminal, the officer led them toward a side door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." Behind them, the shorter officer stayed near the boarding door, arms folded, watching the passengers who craned their necks to see what was happening. Inside the operations corridor, the air was cooler, quieter. The hum of voices from the gate area faded, replaced by the low buzz of radios and the rhythmic beeping of equipment. They passed two staff members who looked up in surprise, their eyes flicking from Victoria to Jalen, then quickly away. The officer stopped at a glass door with a card reader. A woman in a navy blazer approached from inside, her ID badge swinging on a lanyard. "Renee Nakamura, Operations Supervisor," she said, extending a hand. Victoria shook it. "We need to see the gate logs for Flight 742. Now." Renee hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. "This way." In the control room, a wall of monitors displayed flight schedules, gate assignments, and weather patterns. Renee led them to a side station where a younger employee was typing quickly. "Pull up the manifest for Flight 742 and the scan logs," she instructed. Within seconds, two lists appeared on the screen. One showed the manifest as it had been loaded into the system. The other showed the actual boarding scans. Renee pointed. "Here, passenger Brooks, Jalen, seat 3A, scanned at 9:47 a.m. Victoria glanced at Jalen. "That seems pretty clear." Renee's eyes moved between them. "I'll notify the captain." "No," Victoria said. "I'll notify the captain." She pulled out her phone and dialed. "Langford, this is Victoria Brooks. The manifest was not updated after the gate scan. That's your crew's error. My son will return to his seat. You will also prepare to submit a compliance statement to corporate before departure." Langford's voice crackled through the speaker. "Understood." Victoria ended the call, then turned to Renee. "Please log this as a priority incident for review under shareholder oversight. And note that I am activating Level 4 privileges." Renee's brows rose slightly, but she nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Jalen watched her, quiet but alert. There was no gloating in her tone, no anger, just precision. The same precision she used in boardrooms, now aimed at the heart of this moment. On the way back to the gate, the officer glanced at Jalen. "Your mom always like this." Jalen allowed himself a small smile. "Pretty much." When they stepped back into the terminal, Megan's phone immediately caught sight of them through the boarding door. Her voice rose in a half-whisper to her viewers. "They're back." Victoria entered the cabin first, her gaze sweeping over the passengers. "Mr. Brooks will be returning to his seat," she said simply. Helen stood at the galley, her jaw tight. She stepped back without a word as Jalen walked past her to 3A. The man in 3B gave him a nod. Judge Graves in 1B offered a quiet, "Welcome back, young man." Megan's phone blinked with a flood of comments. "He's back." She won. "Don't mess with moms like that." Langford stayed in the cockpit, his voice coming over the intercom a moment later. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are holding briefly for final clearance. Thank you for your patience." Victoria didn't sit. She stood near the boarding door, speaking quietly with the taller officer. "This will be addressed before we leave the ground," she said, "and not just for my son." The officer nodded. Understood. Jalen settled into his seat again, his book in his lap. The cabin noise returned in small waves, zippers closing, bags shifting, the low murmur of passengers talking. But the air still carried the charge of what had just happened. He glanced toward his mother, still standing in the aisle, and thought about how quickly she had taken control, how she had turned something that felt personal into something bigger, and he knew this was not over. Victoria Brooks stood just inside the boarding door, the low murmur of the cabin pressing in from all sides. She had not sat down because this was not yet finished. She knew better than to celebrate a small win when the larger battle was still in motion. She glanced at her son. Jalen was in 3A again, his posture calm, book open, but she could see the way his fingers held the pages, not turning them, not reading, just there. That look in his eyes, she recognized it. Not fear, not even anger. It was something heavier. The look of someone deciding how much of himself to give away in public and how much to protect. She had seen that look in boardrooms and on construction sites, in airports and at charity galas. Black men measuring the cost of existing in spaces where people doubted they belonged. The taller security officer stepped up beside her. "Ma'am, I'll stay here until we push back, just in case." Victoria nodded once. Appreciated. She checked her watch. 5 minutes until scheduled departure. She had already told the captain to hold. She was not in a rush. This was her arena now. Helen stood in the galley, fussing with a stack of napkins that did not need fussing. Evan lingered near the curtain to economy, clearly wanting to be anywhere else. The passengers had gone quieter again, as if they sensed something still brewing. Victoria took her phone from her bag and began typing. The message was short, but it carried weight. Activate standby clause. She hit send, 2 rows back. Megan Lewis felt her phone vibrate. She glanced at the screen and saw her live stream chat exploding. They're saying she's sending some kind of command. One commenter wrote, "This is about to get serious." Victoria put her phone away and looked toward the galley. "Ms. Morris," she said evenly. Helen turned, masking her surprise. "Yes." "Ma'am, I want the name of the gate agent who loaded this manifest," Victoria said, "and the timestamp for when first-class passenger verification was completed." Helen hesitated. I'd have to check with the captain for that information." "No," Victoria said. "You will check with the gate. Now." Helen's lips pressed together. She picked up the interphone and began speaking quietly, glancing over her shoulder as if hoping Victoria might move away. Victoria did not move. Judge Graves shifted in his seat, a faint smile on his face. He was watching, not for entertainment, but for precision, the way Victoria asked for exactly what she needed and nothing more. In the terminal, the shorter security officer received a call on his radio. His eyes flicked toward the plane, then toward the departure board. Flight 742 now read, delayed, pending authorization. Megan's viewers noticed it too. "It's official," she whispered into her mic. "We're not going anywhere yet." Helen hung up the phone and returned to Victoria. "Gate says they'll call back with the info." "Good," Victoria replied. "And when they do, you'll bring it to me before you give it to anyone else." Helen nodded stiffly and returned to the galley. The taller officer leaned slightly toward Victoria. "Ma'am, I've been in this job for 20 years. I've never seen a passenger talk to a captain like that." "I'm not a passenger," Victoria said. "I'm a shareholder." The words were not loud, but Jalen heard them, and he realized that in her world, that distinction meant everything. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, a message from her chief of staff. "Press team ready. Statement in draft form. Approval." She typed back, "Not yet." This was not the time for statements. This was the time for action. Renee Nakamura, the operations supervisor, appeared at the door again. She stepped inside, holding a small folder. "Ms. Brooks, gate logs and scan records." Victoria accepted them, flipping through each page with care. Scanned at 9:47 a.m., she read aloud, "Seat 3A confirmed. No notation of upgrade or reassignment." She closed the folder. Captain Langford. She called toward the cockpit. He stepped out, his expression neutral but his eyes wary. "You have in your possession a manifest that does not match the gate logs," Victoria said. "Do you know what that means?" Langford glanced at Helen, then back at Victoria. "It means there was a clerical error." "No," Victoria said. "It means you removed a passenger with valid documentation based on incomplete data. That is a compliance breach, and you did it in front of witnesses." Langford shifted his weight. "Ma'am, with all respect, this is not about respect," Victoria said. "It's about responsibility. And right now, your responsibility is to ensure that this flight departs with every passenger in their assigned seat, including my son." Langford said nothing. Victoria took a step closer. "And when we land in Seattle, you will file a report that includes the reason this happened. Use the word assumption in your statement. Captain, because that is what this was." A muscle in Langford's jaw ticked. He gave a tight nod and returned to the cockpit. Victoria turned to Renee. "Please contact corporate operations. Inform them that a shareholder intervention has taken place on Flight 742. Use those words." Renee nodded and stepped back into the terminal. The taller officer murmured, "That's going to light up some phones." "That's the point," Victoria said. "In 2D, Megan looked down at her phone and saw the chat scroll so fast she could hardly read it. "She's running the plane now. This is savage. I want her on my side." Jalen closed his book and set it on the tray table. His voice was quiet when he spoke to his mother. "You don't have to do all this." Victoria looked at him, her expression softening for the first time since she boarded. "Yes, I do, because of me, because of every kid who's going to sit in a seat like this one day," she said, "and I don't want them to need someone like me to prove they belong." He nodded slowly. The tightness in his chest eased, just a little. The boarding door closed, the heavy thud echoing through the cabin. The shorter officer stepped off, leaving the taller one to ride the jump seat until pushback. Victoria finally took her seat in 2A. She buckled in, smoothed her jacket, and opened her phone again. This time, she typed approve. Somewhere in the city, the press team pressed send, and in the control rooms of Pacific Skies Airlines, the name Victoria Brooks began flashing across internal alerts. The cabin air felt too still, like the moment before a storm. Passengers who had been murmuring quietly began to glance toward the boarding door again. Something was happening beyond the thin wall between the aircraft and the terminal. In the jet bridge. Victoria Brooks stepped out, the taller security officer at her side. She walked with the same measured pace she had used when she first approached the plane, deliberate, unhurried, but with each step carrying the weight of someone who knew the floor beneath her belonged to her. At the gate, Renee Nakamura was waiting with two other figures in dark suits. One was a tall man in his 50s with a perfectly knotted tie and a corporate badge clipped to his lapel. The other was shorter, rounder, with the kind of nervous energy that made him shift his weight from foot to foot. The taller man stepped forward. "Ms. Brooks, I'm Colin Harper, Chief Operating Officer for Pacific Skies. I understand there's been some confusion on board." Victoria's eyes met his without hesitation. "It is not confusion. It is a compliance violation. Your crew removed my son from his assigned seat without verifying his boarding pass against gate records. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a process failure and a bias issue." Harper tried to smile, the kind of smile meant to smooth edges. "I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. Why don't we—" "I don't need explanations," Victoria cut in. "I need actions, and I need them before this flight leaves the ground." The shorter man cleared his throat. "Ms. Brooks, if we can just—" "Who are you?" she asked, her tone neutral but edged with precision. "Paul Simmons, gate lead, then you were the one responsible for verifying the manifest." Paul hesitated. "Well, yes, but did you scan my son's boarding pass?" Paul shifted again. I believe the gate agent did. Yes. Do you have the scan record?" He glanced toward Renee, who was holding the folder from earlier. She handed it to Victoria without a word. Victoria opened it and held up the page. "Scanned at 9:47 a.m. Assigned seat 3A. This record was available before the crew removed him. So tell me, Mr. Simmons, why was this not cross-checked?" Paul swallowed hard. "It should have been." "Yes," Victoria said softly. "It should have been." Harper stepped in, his voice low and measured. "Ms. Brooks, we can resolve this quietly. The captain is ready to depart, and your son is back in his seat. Let's avoid unnecessary delays." Victoria studied him for a long moment. "Mr. Harper, do you know what the difference is between a delay and a grounding?" He blinked. "A delay is temporary. A grounding is, well, serious." "Exactly," she said. "And I decide which one this is." Behind her, the taller officer kept his gaze on the gate entrance, watching passengers pass by. Megan's live stream was still running from inside the cabin, her voice a low murmur as she narrated what little she could see. "I need the following," Victoria said to Harper. "First, a written commitment that your crew will undergo bias training within the next 30 days. Second, a public apology addressed to my son by name. Third, a review of your verification protocols to ensure this never happens again. And fourth, I want the captain's full incident report sent to my office before this plane touches down in Seattle. Harper's polite expression faltered. Ms. Brooks, that's a lot to process while we're on the ground. Victoria's tone didn't change. If it's too much to process, I'll be happy to initiate a shareholder compliance audit instead. That process is slower and much louder. The shorter man beside Harper shifted again, glancing toward the boarding door like he wanted to be anywhere else. Renee spoke up. Ms. Brooks, may I suggest we move this to the operations suite? The passengers are beginning to notice the extended hold. They already noticed, Victoria said, and if you think I'm worried about appearances, you've misunderstood why I'm here. Harper glanced at his watch, then back at her. All right, we'll agree to the training and the protocol review. The apology, I'll need to clear that with legal. Victoria didn't blink. Then clear it now. Harper's jaw tightened. He stepped aside, pulling out his phone. Victoria stood still, her hands folded loosely in front of her. She didn't check her own phone. She didn't need to. The rhythm of control was already in her favor. Inside the cabin, passengers leaned toward the aisle, straining to catch glimpses through the open door. Jalen sat back in his seat, staring out the window at the tarmac, the faint reflection of his own face staring back. His thoughts were a mix of relief and discomfort. He hated that she had to fight like this, but part of him was proud too, proud that she didn't let the moment pass quietly. Megan whispered into her phone, "They're still talking outside. The COO is here. This is big." After a few minutes, Harper returned. "The apology will be issued. Legal has cleared it. We'll send a copy to your office for approval." Victoria gave a single nod. "Good. Then we'll return to the plane." The group moved back toward the boarding door. As they stepped inside, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Passengers straightened in their seats, conversations halting. Victoria walked the aisle with Harper a step behind her. She stopped beside Jalen's seat. "Everything will be handled," she said quietly. Jalen met her eyes. "I know." She looked at Harper. "Tell them, Mr. Koo." Harper cleared his throat, addressing the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, there was an error in our verification process earlier. It has been resolved. We apologize for the inconvenience and thank you for your patience. It was the kind of announcement that was meant to be neutral, but every passenger in first class knew exactly what had happened." Victoria returned to her seat in 2A. Harper lingered near the galley, speaking quietly to Helen, whose expression had tightened to the point of discomfort. Evan avoided their gaze entirely, busying himself with securing the galley carts. Judge Graves leaned forward slightly in his seat, catching Victoria's eye. He gave a small nod of approval. She returned it with the faintest smile. The boarding door closed again. The taller officer stepped off into the jet bridge. Harper retreated toward the cockpit to speak with Langford. Victoria adjusted her seat belt, her posture calm, but inside, she was still calculating. This was not just about a seat. This was about a system that needed to be shown in no uncertain terms. That assumption was not policy. Jalen looked down at his book, then closed it. He didn't feel like reading. Instead, he let his gaze rest on the seat in front of him, listening to the muted sounds of the cabin. The plane might be ready to move, but he knew his mother wasn't finished. The hum of the engines outside was distant now. In the narrow service corridor behind the gate, the air felt cooler, more mechanical. Victoria Brooks walked ahead, the taller security officer matching her pace, Colin Harper close behind. Renee Nakamura keyed them through a set of glass doors that opened into the heart of the airport's operations control. The room was a wide expanse of screens and stations. Monitors displayed arrival and departure schedules, weather maps, gate statuses, and blinking alerts. Every seat was occupied by staff wearing headsets, their voices low and rapid as they coordinated flights across multiple time zones. It smelled faintly of coffee and static electricity, the kind of scent that clung to rooms that never truly went silent. A man in a gray suit approached from one of the side stations, his expression curious and wary. "Ma'am, this area is restricted to operations personnel." Victoria did not slow her pace. "I am operations personnel when it comes to Flight 742, she said. "Level 4 shareholder authority. You can check with your corporate liaison if you doubt it." The man hesitated, then stepped aside. Harper followed, clearly less confident now that they were in the airline's nerve center, where records and decisions were tracked in real time. Victoria stopped at a central console and looked to Renee. "Bring up the incident log for Flight 742. Include the manifest history and the gate scan record." Within moments, a staffer's fingers danced across a keyboard. On the main screen, the data appeared: 9:47 a.m., passenger Brooks, Jalen, seat 3A, boarding pass scanned, verified by gate agent S, Pierce, 9:49 a.m., manifest refresh incomplete, seat 3A flagged as empty, 10:02 a.m., passenger removed from seat by lead cabin crew Helen Morris, supported by Captain Drew Langford, reason manifest mismatch. The words were clinical, stripped of emotion, but the sequence spoke volumes. Victoria turned to Harper. "Do you see the gap, a 2-minute difference between a valid scan and an incomplete manifest update? Your system failed to synchronize before boarding completed. That is a procedural flaw." Harper cleared his throat. "I agree, the sync issue is a problem, but the crew acted on the information they had." "No," Victoria said. "The crew acted on an assumption. They had the option to verify with the gate before removing him. They chose not to. That is the failure. The system may have glitched, but people made decisions." Her voice carried no anger, but the precision in it drew the attention of several staff nearby. Screens around the room flickered as other flights' data shifted, but all eyes in that small circle were on her. Renee stood quietly to one side, observing. She had seen executives lose their temper in this room before, shouting, threats, ultimatums, but this was different. Victoria's calm was surgical. Every sentence landed like a documented fact, unshakable. "Pull up the crew profiles for this flight," Victoria said. Another staffer keyed it in. "Helen Morris, senior cabin crew, 28 years with the airline. Evan Price, junior cabin crew, 1 year. Captain Drew Langford, 14 years. Victoria read the profiles in silence for a moment. Then she looked to Harper. "I will be requesting a full review of Helen Morris's passenger interactions over the past 2 years, with particular attention to discretionary seating decisions. If there is a pattern, you will address it. If there is bias, you will terminate." Harper opened his mouth, then closed it again. "And Captain Langford," Victoria continued, will submit a report explaining why he did not verify with gate records before escalating to security. That report will be copied to my office and to your compliance division." Renee shifted slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Ma'am, are you intending to file an official grounding order?" Victoria's eyes moved to the main departure board on the wall. Flight 742 still read, "Delayed, pending authorization." She let the silence stretch for several seconds. "Yes," she said finally, "until my conditions are met. This aircraft is grounded." The words landed like a dropped anchor. Several staffers glanced at each other. Harper's face tightened. "Victoria, you know what a grounding means in operational terms. It will affect connecting flights, crew rotations, even international schedules." "That is not my problem," she said evenly. "My problem is that your crew removed a paying passenger from a confirmed seat based on a false assumption, and that passenger happens to be my son. This isn't about inconvenience. This is about precedent." She stepped closer to the console and tapped the edge of the manifest screen. If this had been a stranger, someone without the means to escalate, they would have been humiliated, dismissed, and forgotten by the time you landed. I am not allowing that to be your standard. The taller security officer glanced toward Harper. "She's right," he said quietly. Victoria's phone buzzed. She took it out, glanced at the screen, and gave a small nod. "My legal team is ready to initiate a compliance review if needed. I'd prefer to resolve it here, but I will escalate if I have to." Harper exhaled slowly. "What are your exact conditions for lifting the grounding?" Victoria held up a finger. 1. Jalen returns to his seat with a documented apology from the captain before takeoff. 2. Crew compliance training scheduled within 30 days, non-negotiable. 3. Review of discretionary seating removals across the last 24 months for all senior crew. 4. System sync protocols corrected before the end of the quarter. And, if we agree, Harper asked, then the grounding is lifted, Victoria said, and you keep this out of the press. That part is your job, not mine. The tension in the room shifted. Harper looked at Renee, then at the staffers who had been listening. He gave a tight nod. "We'll do it." Victoria's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the message and allowed herself the faintest smile. "Good. Then let's return to the gate." As they walked back through the glass doors, Harper leaned in. "Victoria, you know the only reason we're agreeing this quickly is because of who you are." She glanced at him. "And the only reason we're having this conversation is because of who he is. Remember that." In the jet bridge, the muffled hum of the cabin returned. Passengers inside craned their necks toward the door. Megan's phone camera was already aimed that way. Victoria stepped in first, followed by Harper and the officer. She went straight to 3A, where Jalen sat with his hands folded over his book. "It's handle," she said quietly. Jalen looked up at her. "You sure?" "Yes," she said. "They're going to put it in writing." Captain Langford emerged from the cockpit, holding a small notepad. He stopped beside Jalen's seat. "Mr. Brooks," he said, his voice low but audible to the surrounding passengers, "I apologize for the earlier misunderstanding. You are, of course, entitled to this seat." Jalen studied him for a moment, then gave a single nod. "Thank you." Victoria returned to her seat in 2A. She glanced down the aisle at Megan, who lowered her phone slightly but kept it running. The mood in the cabin had shifted again, no longer just curiosity, but a quiet acknowledgement that something significant had happened. The boarding door closed with a soft thud, but even as the engines prepared to start, Victoria knew the real movement was happening far from the tarmac, in the systems and policies that would now be forced to change. The hum of the engines rose, but it was not accompanied by the usual taxi forward. Flight 742 sat motionless at the gate. The air inside the cabin felt heavier, a low current of anticipation running from row to row. Jalen Brooks adjusted the seatbelt across his lap. His mother sat beside him, composed, one hand resting lightly on the armrest, the other scrolling through her phone. Her face revealed nothing, but he could tell she was still working, still pulling unseen strings. In the galley, Helen Morris stood rigid, her hands clasped behind her back. Evan Price kept his eyes down, double-checking the beverage carts for no real reason other than to stay busy. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We are currently finalizing operational matters before departure. We'll provide an updated departure time as soon as possible." It was the kind of vague announcement meant to calm passengers without telling them anything. But here, in first class, everyone knew there was more to it. They had seen the COO board. They had seen Victoria leave the plane with security and return again. This was not a simple delay. Jalen glanced sideways at his mother. "You're not going to let them fly yet, are you?" Victoria's eyes stayed on her phone. "Not until every piece is in place. What if the other passengers get mad?" "They might," she said softly. "But they'll forget this delay by the time they land. What they won't forget is watching a wrong get corrected right in front of them." In seat 1B. Judge Graves shifted slightly and smiled to himself. He had seen this kind of standoff before, though never in the middle of a commercial flight. What impressed him was Victoria's stillness. People often mistook stillness for passivity. Here, it was control. A soft chime came from the intercom. "Ms. Brooks," the captain's voice said, "could you step to the front of the cabin? Please." She rose without hurry and walked to the galley where Captain Langford stood waiting. His posture was rigid, his jaw tight. Beside him, Harper leaned against the jump seat, a tablet in his hand. "We have your conditions drafted," Harper said, offering her the screen. "Training for all senior crew within 30 days. Review of discretionary removals for the past 2 years. System sync protocols updated by end of quarter, and a written apology to your son before we leave the gate." Victoria read each item slowly, as though weighing not just the words but the intent behind them. "You're missing one," she said at last. Harper frowned. "Which one? Accountability for the individuals involved? I want assurance that if the review finds a pattern of bias in any crew member's record, that person will be removed from passenger-facing duties immediately." Harper glanced at Langford. The captain looked away, focusing on a spot over Victoria's shoulder. "It's a significant step," Harper said. "It's a necessary one," she replied. After a pause, Harper nodded and tapped the screen, adding the clause. He turned it for her to see again. "Now," Victoria said, "you'll sign it, Captain." Langford's eyes flickered. "That's not standard procedure for a captain. This wasn't a standard flight," she said evenly. "Your signature is a recognition that you take responsibility for the decisions made under your command. Nothing more, nothing less." The captain's hand tightened around the pen Harper handed him. He signed quickly, returning it without looking up. Victoria studied the digital signature, then nodded. "Now, the apology. Langford's voice was flat but audible. "Mr. Brooks, I apologize for removing you from your seat without verifying the manifest. You had every right to be there." Jalen met his gaze. "Thank you." Helen, standing behind the captain, shifted uncomfortably. She said nothing, but Victoria's eyes moved to her. "And you, Ms." Morris Helen's mouth pressed into a thin line. "I apologize, Mr. Brooks." It was quiet, reluctant, but it was there. Victoria returned to her seat. Jalen looked at her with a mixture of pride and disbelief. "You really made them do it." She gave a small smile. "It's not about making them. It's about making sure they understand why they have to." Over in 2D. Megan kept her phone low but recording. Her viewers were already buzzing with speculation. Some called Victoria a hero. Others debated the ethics of grounding a flight for personal reasons. Megan didn't comment. She knew the story was more complicated than either side realized. The engines powered down again. The movement of ground crew outside was visible through the windows. Harper returned to the galley and spoke quietly to the captain. Then Victoria's phone buzzed. She read the message, then looked up toward the cockpit. All conditions met, she said to herself. She leaned slightly toward Jalen. "We'll fly now." Just like that he asked. Just like that, she said. The captain made another announcement, his tone measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now cleared for departure. Thank you for your patience." The plane pushed back from the gate. Passengers settled in, some whispering, some closing their eyes. The hum of the engines rose again, this time with forward motion. But for Victoria, the real movement had already happened. The agreements, the signatures, the promises, those were the levers that mattered. She knew Pacific Skies would try to minimize the incident. She also knew her legal team already had every document they needed. Jalen leaned back in his seat. "So that's it. For now," she said. "But when we land, the work begins." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're going to make it bigger, aren't you?" Her eyes stayed on the clouds beginning to streak past the window. "I'm going to make it matter. Inside the galley." Helen busied herself with service preparations, her movements stiff. Evan worked beside her, quiet, but his glances toward Jalen carried something different. Maybe a recognition, maybe regret. In 1B, Judge Graves folded his hands over his lap. "That," he murmured to himself, "is how change starts. One seat at a time." The plane lifted into the air. Passengers adjusted headphones, opened books, or stared out at the sprawling city below. For most, this flight would be just another trip, remembered only for a minor delay. But for Jalen Brooks, and for the airline that had tried to move him out of place, the real journey had only begun. The engine's steady drone filled the cabin as the aircraft climbed into the thin, silver-blue morning sky. The sunlight spilled through the windows, cutting sharp angles across the cream leather seats of first class. Passengers began to relax into their personal spaces, but there was still a hum of awareness lingering in the air, a quiet sense that something more than altitude had shifted during the delay. Victoria Brooks sat with her tray table down, a glass of water in front of her. She had not touched it. Her phone rested on the table, face down, though every so often she would lift it, scan a message, type briefly, and return it to its place. Jalen stared out the window at the patchwork earth below. The morning light made the rivers glint like ribbons of metal. He pressed his forehead lightly against the glass. "You think they hate us now?" he asked quietly. Victoria didn't look at him right away. If someone resents you for standing up for yourself, that's not your weight to carry. He sighed. I don't want to be the reason everyone's trip is ruined. Everyone's trip is still happening, she said, yours included. The only difference is that now, the people responsible for what happened will have to answer for it. From 2 rows back, Megan Lewis angled her phone slightly, filming the view out her own window. Her voice was hushed as she narrated, "We're cruising now. Everyone's calm. But if you've been following since the gate, you know this isn't over." Her comment section was alive with speculation. A few praising Victoria's composure, others debating whether she had overstepped. In the galley, Evan Price poured coffee into a small stainless pot, his hands steady but his mind elsewhere. He glanced toward the front of the cabin where Jalen sat, then back down to his task. Helen Morris stood beside him, her voice low. "You should be careful with them," she murmured. Evan looked up. "With who, you know who. People like that, they know how to make noise." He set the coffee pot down a little too hard. Or maybe they just know how to get treated the way they should have been in the first place. Helen's mouth thinned, but she didn't respond. She turned away, busying herself with arranging sugar packets in 1B. Judge Graves had removed a small leather notebook from his briefcase. He jotted a few lines in neat handwriting, then closed it again. Catching Victoria's eye, he said, "You know, sometimes the real audience isn't in the room, it's in the system that will read the report later." She nodded slightly. "I know. But sometimes you need both audiences, the one now and the one that will come after." Jalen shifted in his seat, finally turning to face her. What if the apology was just to shut us up? What if they don't really change anything? "Then we make it public," she said simply, "and we keep going until change is cheaper for them than pretending." The flight attendants began moving down the aisle with the beverage service. Evan stopped at Victoria's row. "Would you like something to drink?" She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Water is fine." Evan poured it quietly, his voice low. "For what it's worth. I'm sorry for how it went down. I didn't agree with it, but I didn't speak up either." Victoria met his eyes for a moment, then nodded once, noted. Jalen glanced between them but said nothing. Helen approached with the next cart, pausing briefly. Her words were polite but clipped. "Anything for you, Mr. Brooks?" "No, thank you," Jalen said. She moved on without another word. The cabin settled into a quieter rhythm. The seatbelt sign had long been turned off, and a few passengers reclined their seats, closing their eyes, but Victoria's mind stayed active. She mentally walked through each step that would follow the review process, the compliance reports, the monitoring of promised training. She thought about the optics for Pacific Skies and the likelihood they would try to minimize the story. She thought about her own responsibility, not just to her son, but to the people who would never have the leverage to push back in the same way. At one point, she opened her phone and drafted an email to her chief of staff. "Prepare to coordinate with media contacts. We may need to control the narrative before they do." Jalen broke the silence. "You're not even mad. Are you not like yelling mad?" She shook her head. "Anger burns too fast. I'd rather be steady enough to finish what I start." Megan, from her seat, watched Victoria's profile and thought how different she seemed from the executives she had seen on the news. Not flashy, not loud, but unshakable. The kind of presence that made you think twice before underestimating her. As the flight crossed into higher altitude, the seatbelt sign flickered on again. The captain's voice was calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some light turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The plane gave a soft shudder, then leveled again. Jalen gripped the armrest briefly, then released it. Victoria turned her head slightly. Nervous a little. He admitted. "Good," she said. "It means you're paying attention, but don't hold on too tight. The plane is built to handle worse than this. It was meant for the turbulence, but Jalen knew she was talking about more than just the air around them." The rest of the flight passed in a series of small moments. The clink of coffee cups in the galley. The whisper of pages turning as Judge Graves read a book. The muted laughter from a couple in the last row of first class. But beneath it all, there was still that undercurrent. A quiet recognition that what had happened before takeoff was going to echo long after landing. When the captain finally announced their descent into Seattle, Jalen looked out at the unfolding coastline below. The water was bright in the afternoon sun, dotted with ships. "You ready?" Victoria asked. "For what?" "For whatever comes next," she said. He thought for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I think so." As the plane angled toward the runway, Victoria allowed herself one long breath. This battle was closing, but the campaign was only just beginning. The seatbelt sign chimed on as the nose of the aircraft dipped slightly. Outside the window, Seattle's waterfront unfolded in the pale afternoon light. Ferries carving neat white wakes across the bay. The city's skyline rose in a blend of glass and steel, framed by the distant mountains. Jalen Brooks sat forward, his backpack already at his feet, though the crew had yet to clear the cabin. His stomach tightened. He didn't know what exactly waited beyond the gate. But the way his mother's phone had been buzzing for the past 15 minutes told him it wasn't going to be quiet. Victoria Brooks sat upright, her phone in one hand, her other resting lightly on the armrest. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes were alert, scanning the last few incoming messages. She was already thinking 3 moves ahead. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Seattle. We'll be at the gate shortly. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off." From her seat in 2D, Megan Lewis kept her phone angled low, the camera running. Her live stream audience had grown steadily since they pushed back from the gate in Los Angeles. The comments were a mix of curiosity, outrage, and armchair legal advice. She didn't speak into the mic this time. The story didn't need narration anymore. The landing was smooth, the tires humming against the runway before the engines reversed. The cabin tilted forward slightly, then leveled as the plane slowed. The seatbelt sign clicked off. Passengers unbuckled and reached for the overhead bins, but Victoria didn't move. She looked at Jalen. "Wait." He glanced at her. "For what you'll see." The doors opened with a faint hiss, letting in the scent of jet fuel and cool air from the jet bridge. In the forward galley, Helen Morris stood with her professional smile fixed in place. Evan Pross was beside her, helping passengers step into the aisle. The first few rows began to empty, passengers rolling their bags forward. As Victoria and Jalen finally stood, Megan slipped out of her seat and fell in behind them, her phone steady in her hand. When they stepped into the jet bridge, Jalen's breath caught. Beyond the glass doors at the end was a crowd, not just other travelers, but people holding cameras and microphones. The staccato clicks of camera shutters reached them even through the glass. "They're here for you?" Jalen asked. Victoria didn't answer. She just adjusted the strap of her handbag and kept walking. As the doors opened, the noise hit like a wave. "Ms. Brooks, can you confirm you grounded the flight? Was your son discriminated against? Do you plan to sue Pacific Skies?" Microphones appeared from all sides, some with network logos, others from independent outlets. The airport's polished tile floor reflected the swirl of camera flashes and movement. Victoria stopped just past the threshold, raising a hand slightly, the noise dulled enough for her voice to carry. "My son and I were passengers on Flight 742 this morning," she said. "We experienced an incident that reflected a breakdown in both system protocol and human judgment. The airline has agreed to immediate steps to address both." "Was this about race?" a reporter called out. Victoria met the question without flinching. It was about dignity, and about the assumptions people make when they believe no one will hold them accountable. Jalen shifted beside her, feeling every eye and lens on him. "Did the crew apologize?" another voice asked. "Yes," Victoria said, and the apology was documented. "But an apology without change is just a performance. I expect change." A man in a gray jacket pushed forward. "Ms. Brooks, what about the other passengers? Do you feel bad for delaying their travel?" She paused, her gaze steady on him. "Delays are inconvenient. Discrimination is unacceptable. If you can't see the difference, you're part of the problem." The murmurs in the crowd shifted. A few heads nodded. Judge Graves emerged from the jet bridge a few paces behind them, briefcase in hand. He caught Victoria's eye and gave a subtle nod before disappearing into the terminal. Colin Harper appeared near the edge of the crowd, flanked by two airline PR representatives. His face was tight. He stepped up beside her, speaking low enough for only she and Jalen to hear. "We didn't call them." "I know," Victoria said without looking at him. "But they came anyway." Harper hesitated, then retreated into the background. The questions kept coming. But Victoria didn't linger. She touched Jalen's elbow and guided him toward the terminal exit. Megan followed, her stream still running, capturing every word and angle. As they walked, Jalen exhaled slowly. That was a lot. Victoria smiled faintly. That was just the prelude. In the quieter space beyond the media cluster, she finally slowed. "Now we wait for their statement. And if they try to spin it, we release ours." Jalen glanced back toward the gates. "You think they'll actually follow through?" She adjusted the strap of her bag. "They will. Because now it's not just about us. It's about every person watching, and every person who's been here before and never got this far." Megan stepped forward, tucking her phone into her jacket. "That was powerful," she said. "You probably just made yourself a lot of enemies at Pacific Skies." Victoria's tone was calm. "Maybe. Or maybe I just reminded them who their passengers really are." The three of them reached the curb outside, where a black sedan idled. The driver stepped forward to open the door. Before getting in, Victoria looked up at the pale Seattle sky. The air was crisp, the kind that carried sound far and clear. She knew the story would travel even farther. The rain had started by the time Victoria and Jalen reached their downtown hotel. The lobby smelled faintly of cedar and coffee, a welcome contrast to the sterile chill of the airport. The front desk clerk greeted them with the polite warmth reserved for high-profile guests, but Victoria barely paused long enough to sign the room form. She had other priorities. They took the elevator to the top floor. inside their suite. Jalen dropped his backpack on the couch and collapsed beside it. His shoulders finally loosened. "Can we just not talk about it for a while?" he asked. Victoria gave him a small nod. "Rest. I have a call." She stepped into the adjoining room, closing the door behind her. The rain tapped against the tall windows as she opened her laptop. The call connected within seconds. On the screen, 4 faces appeared: 2 board members of Pacific Skies, their chief legal counsel, and Colin Harper, still in his suit from the airport. Their expressions were a mix of fatigue and guarded formality. Colin spoke first. "We're in containment mode. The footage is everywhere. Megan Lewis's live stream has been clipped into dozens of short videos. It's trending on 3 platforms." Victoria leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. "Containment won't help you, not unless you intend to deny everything, and that would be foolish given how many witnesses were in that cabin." The legal counsel adjusted his glasses. "We're not denying the incident occurred. We're concerned about precedent. Grounding a flight at the request of a passenger, even a shareholder, sets a dangerous operational example." "You set the precedent," Victoria said evenly. "When your crew decided a teenager in the right seat was a problem to be removed. I didn't create this. I responded to it." One of the board members cleared her throat. "Victoria, we all understand this was handled poorly, but you forced us into the public eye before we had a chance to assess internally. That complicates things." "Complications," Victoria said, "are what happen when companies mistake silence for safety. You don't need time to assess whether this was wrong. You need courage to admit it." Colin exhaled slowly. "The training protocols you demanded, we're moving on them. The accountability clause will take longer. HR is already balking. Then you move faster," she replied. "Because every hour you delay, the story grows without your input, and you should know your competitors are watching. One of them has already reached out to me, wanting to know if they can meet the new standards I outlined before you do." That made them shift in their seats. The board member, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "Are you implying you'd help another airline use this against us?" Victoria's voice stayed calm. "I'm implying that the standard will change, with or without Pacific Skies leading it." There was a pause, filled only by the soft hiss of rain against the glass. The legal counsel finally spoke again. "We need to manage the narrative. Would you be willing to issue a joint statement with the airline?" "I'll issue a statement," Victoria said, "but it won't be a shield for you. It will be a challenge for you to do better. If you want to stand beside that, you can." Colin's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. "Fine. Draft your language. Send it to me before noon tomorrow." The call ended without further small talk. Victoria closed the laptop and sat in the quiet for a moment, letting the rain fill the space. In the other room, Jalen had dozed off, one arm draped over the back of the couch. She watched him for a moment before moving to the kitchenette and pouring herself a glass of water. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Renee Nakamura, the operations supervisor from the gate earlier that day. "They're already scrubbing internal chat logs." "You were right. They're trying to reframe it," Victoria typed back. "Let them try. We have the truth." Meanwhile, across town in a glass-walled conference room at Pacific Skies headquarters, the atmosphere was different. The CEO, Robert Ashton, stood at the head of the table, flanked by executives and department heads. "This is a fire," Ashton said, "and it's not going out quietly. Legal, PR, operations, we need one voice. I don't want another employee making an offhand comment to the press that gives Brooks more leverage. A marketing VP shifted in his chair. With respect, sir, she already has all the leverage she needs. Public opinion is leaning heavily in her favor. If we try to paint this as a misunderstanding, we look defensive. If we admit fault, we open ourselves up to legal claims. Either way, we bleed, Ashton said. Colin Harper's voice cut in from the end of the table. We bleed less if we lead the change instead of resisting it. The room went still. Ashton looked at him. You're suggesting we give her everything she asked for. I'm suggesting, Colin said carefully, that we make this the last story of its kind about Pacific skies. We can survive 1 week of headlines. We can't survive being the face of systemic discrimination for the next year. The CEO's gaze stayed on him for a long moment. Then he turned to PR. Work with Harper. Full compliance on the new training protocols. Start the review of removal records immediately. And I want a preliminary report in 72 hours. Someone at the far end of the table muttered, That's impossible. Ashton didn't raise his voice. Then make it possible. Back in the hotel. Victoria sat beside Jalen as he stirred awake. He blinked up at her. Did you win? She smiled faintly. Winning isn't the point, but they heard me, and they know I'm not done. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. What happens next? Next, she said, we see if they keep their word. And if they don't, we make sure the world knows why. Jalen leaned back into the couch, processing her words. For the first time that day, he didn't feel like the kid who had been humiliated in front of strangers. He felt like someone whose voice mattered, even if he hadn't spoken much. Victoria glanced toward the rain-streaked window. She knew the next 24 hours would be critical. Every headline, every post, every clip from that live stream could push the board further toward real change or toward digging in their heels. Either way, she would be ready. The next morning broke with a muted silver light over Seattle. From the window of the Brooks' hotel suite, the city looked quiet, almost still, but Victoria knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Her phone was already lit with notifications before she'd even taken her first sip of coffee. News alerts, meet-in requests, messages from allies in the corporate world all circling around the same point. The statement from Pacific Skies was about to drop. Jalen shuffled out of his room, hair slightly messy, eyes still heavy with sleep. You've been up for a while, he mumbled. Couldn't sleep? Victoria said. She gestured to the tablet on the coffee table. It's out. He sat beside her as she opened the press release. The airline's logo sat at the top, crisp and corporate, but the words beneath were unusually direct for an industry statement. Pacific Skies. Airlines acknowledges a failure in both policy and practice during Flight 742 on August 8th. The removal request directed at passenger Jalen Brooks was unjustified and inconsistent with our stated values, effective immediately. We will implement revised removal procedures, mandatory bias awareness training for all staff, and independent oversight for passenger treatment complaints. We apologize to the Brooks family and to our passengers worldwide. Victoria read it aloud, her tone measured. When she finished, Jalen let out a low breath. They actually admitted it. They did, she said, and now we hold them to it. Her phone rang, Colin Harper's number. She answered on speaker. You've seen it? Colin asked. Yes. This was the best we could get the board to agree to without locking the statement in committee for weeks. the oversight part. That was your push. I know, Victoria replied. Now the hard part is making sure it's not just words. There was a pause. You've made enemies here, Victoria, but you've also made allies, more than you think. She didn't answer that, only thanked him and ended the call. The rest of the morning moved quickly. Megan Lewis posted a compilation video of the incident, the press conference, and the statement. It racked up millions of views in hours, paired with hashtags calling for reform across the industry. Judge Graves issued a brief comment supporting Pacific Sky's reforms, noting they could serve as a model for aviation conduct standards. By noon, Victoria had her own statement ready. She recorded it in the hotel suite, seated in front of the large windows with the skyline behind her. My son and I boarded Flight 742 expecting to travel, not to become a headline. What happened that day was not unique to us. It is part of a pattern too many have lived through quietly. I want to thank those who stood with us and to acknowledge Pacific Skies for taking this first step. But change is not a press release, it's proof, and proof takes time. We'll be watching. She posted it to her official accounts. Within minutes, the comments filled with stories from other passengers, some years old, all echoing the same truth. Jalen watched the numbers climb. So, this is it. We just wait and see. In a way, Victoria said, but we also keep the conversation alive. We remind them the public has a long memory when it wants to. Later that afternoon, they headed to the airport for their return flight. The terminal felt different this time, not just because of the stares and whispered recognition, but because Victoria walked through it with the quiet authority of someone who had shifted the ground under the company's feet. At the gate, Evan Price stood near the boarding area. Out of uniform, he approached hesitantly. Ms. Brooks, Jalen, I wanted to say thank you for not just letting it go. Victoria inclined her head. You have a choice now. To use it. As they boarded, Jalen glanced out at the tarmac. Planes moved in slow, deliberate patterns, each part of a system that felt too big to change until now. They settled into their seats. This time, no one questioned where they belonged. The crew greeted them politely, almost warmly. As the engines rumbled to life, Jalen leaned toward his mother. You think it's gonna stick? The changes. She looked out the window, watching the ground fall away, not by themselves, but with enough eyes on them. It can. The clouds swallowed the plane in a soft white blur. Jalen sat back, letting the hum of the engines steady his thoughts. He thought about how, 2 days ago, he had felt small and powerless in this same kind of seat. Now, he felt something else, not bigger, exactly, but solid. Seen. An hour into the flight, a passenger from coach approached their row. He was an older black man with kind eyes. He didn't linger, just nodded to Victoria and said, "Thank you, for all of us." After he left, Jalen turned to his mother. "That's why you didn't just take the apology." She smiled faintly. "That's why." When they landed, the applause came from a small group near the baggage claim, strangers who had been following the story online. Jalen felt heat rise to his face, embarrassed and proud at the same time. Outside, the air was warm. The driver loaded their bags into the car. As they pulled away, Jalen watched the planes lifting into the sky, one after another, each carrying its own stories, its own moments of quiet battles and unseen victories. Victoria glanced at him. "You've changed," she said. "Maybe," he admitted. Or maybe I just see things clearer now. The car merged into traffic, the skyline receding behind them. Somewhere, in offices and break rooms across Pacific skies, people were talking about the statement, the protocols, and the passengers who wouldn't let the system stay the same. Victoria Brooks knew this wasn't the end, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start is all you need to change the course of the flight. The flight landed, the headlines spread, and somewhere between the apology and the policy change, a lesson took root, one that no press release could contain. Jalen Brooks walked away from that flight no longer invisible. Victoria Brooks proved that dignity, when defended, can become a blueprint for change. Pacific Skies Airlines will now train differently, act differently, and we hope think differently. But this story isn't just about one family, one crew, or one airline. It's about every person who has ever been told, in words or in silence, you don't belong here. It's about refusing to shrink in the face of that lie, and choosing to confront it calmly, clearly, and completely. Because change doesn't happen when the right person is in the right seat. It happens when the right person refuses to move. If this story moved you, if it made you think, made you angry, or made you proud, help it travel farther. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story that challenges what we accept as normal. Because the next flight we take together might just change everything.